Okay, as others trickle in, I think we will get started in the interest of time. Hi, everyone. My name is Rudro. I work at Carnegie, India, and it gives me the greatest pleasure to introduce you to this particular knowledge transfer session. Now, we call it the knowledge transfer session because this part of the Global Technology Summit is very different and, in many ways, much richer than the several conversations and panels that will commence at 1700 hours today through till the 18th of December. So that's 5 days of 5 themes of the Global Tech Summit. But these sessions are more about coming back to the classroom. It's about going back to school. It's about picking one of 5 key KTs. And we've got KTs on subjects such as open architectures, on fintech, and this very powerful and I think apt one on decoupling and its effects, not only its global effects, but also its effects on India. So there's a story here about geopolitics. There's a story here about the future of tech. And there's certainly a story here about the future of tech in India and the kind of partnerships that entrepreneurs, VCs, public servants, and public policy experts will be looking to explore over the next many months and next many years. So with that, you're in super hands with two incredible individuals, Sahil Kini and Matt Sheehan. Sahil Kini is the founder and CEO of Setu, based in Bengaluru. It's a technology company, and the only reason I'm reading this is because I'm a tech zero, so I just want to make sure I get this right for Sahil. It's a technology company building API infrastructure to enable other companies to offer fintech products. I think what we're going to do is we'll also ask Sahil and Matt to just introduce themselves, their kind of background over the last 5 to 10 or even 15 years. What do they actually do and what do they track? Matt Sheehan is a fellow at the Paulson Institute. It's a think tank. It's the Paulson Institute's Macropolo. He leads work on US-China technology issues. Matt's written a fantastic book which connects in many ways China to California. And it'll be great, Matt, if you can talk a little bit about why you wrote the book and the way that you wrote it. As I said, the idea of this KT of all the KTs is to come back to the classroom. It's to unpack fundamental issues. So I'm sure at some point this is going to dive into deep policy discussions, the Biden administration, India, Xi, China, etc. But it's also to take a step back and say, so where did all of this start? So what are the roots of decoupling and what are its real effects in the field of tech and geopolitics? So with that, I'm going to hand it to Matt Sheehan and Sahil Kini. Thank you both in equal measure, but especially to Matt, because you've got some unearthly hours of logging in and staying awake, hopefully, through these sessions. So Matt and Sahil.
Great. I'll get started then. Thanks so much, Rudy, and to all of Carnegie India for having me. Last year, attending GTS in Bangalore was a really eye-opening experience for me. My world is US, China, and it's been that way for a long time. And over the last year or so, I've been trying to just become less ignorant about all the other interesting technology ecosystems around the world. And since attending GTS last year, I've started to kind of turn a lot of my research attention towards India. And, this was obviously a big year for India-China tech issues. So I have Rudy and I have Carnegie for that. A little bit about my background, and then I'll kind of go right into a presentation on this stuff. So I'm American. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area in Palo Alto, so kind of right in the heart of Silicon Valley. And I lived there up until 2010 when I graduated college and went to China. And I lived in China 2010 to 2016. I did a bunch of different jobs there, but eventually sort of studied Chinese, learned Chinese, and worked as a foreign correspondent. So I was a reporter for, at the time, the World Post over there. And I came back to the US in 2016, in large part to work on the book that Rudra referenced at the beginning there. The book I wrote is about ties between China and California, with the biggest section of that being between China and Silicon Valley. California, my hometown, China, my temporary adopted country, have really deep and rich ties and they go across a bunch of different dimensions. And I think that work eventually led me into focusing on the China-Silicon Valley relationship. And now sort of the majority of my work is on the AI ecosystems, artificial intelligence in the US and China, and looking to expand that a bit more globally. So I'm going to open up my presentation here, and we can use that as kind of a basis for discussion going forward. But yeah, the angle I'm going to take is, technology decoupling, lessons from U.S.-China ties. As I said, U.S.-China is my background. That's where I've spent the most time. But I'm really interested in trying to sort of take that analysis and plug it into different situations and see where some of the same issues following in the way that China relates to Silicon Valley, China relates to the US, how those might port over to the way that India relates to China, and the way that these different tech ecosystems are kind of both deeply integrated and walling each other off. So I'll jump right into an outline. I'm going to kind of break it down just into three sections mostly. The first one on US-China tech ties, and kind of getting at what I see as really the core tension or paradox that kind of defined these relationships for a long time. It's the free flows at a lot of different levels, deep and rich exchanges at a lot of different levels, but also obstacles, basically products and companies unable to enter each other's markets for different ways. So I think that tension right there that we'll explore leads right into sort of the era of decoupling, our subject today. And we're going to sort of present a framework for how to think about decoupling, but then dive into maybe two specific examples of it. So what US-China tech decoupling looks like in terms of money, in terms of investment flows, and then contrast that with how it looks in terms of people-to-people connections, and how sort of decoupling plays out differently and has much different implications depending on what sort of dimension of ties you're looking at. And the third section, going to sort of propose a hypothesis or an analogy for how this US-China relationship relates to or could be used to inform an analysis of India and China's tech relationship, and maybe India and the US's tech relationship. Like I said, I'm new to exploring the Indian tech ecosystem, and I'm really here to learn on that front. So I'll throw out some questions and sort of an idea or two, but then I'll pass it off to Sahil for a much richer analysis of that. And then hopefully we can just kind of talk it out as we go. But first up, US-China tech ties. And to really understand where we are today, or where we have gotten over the last couple of years, it's important to take a step back and look at how these ties evolved over time. So I break it down more or less into four phases. First phase, which you could stretch back into the mid-90s more or less, is one of dependency, Chinese dependency on the US tech ecosystem for money, for talent, for even kind of the basic ideas of what does it mean to be a technology startup, what does it mean to be an internet platform. This was a period of time, from about 1994 through, I think, I more or less date it to 2003, in which you could say the Chinese tech ecosystem was heavily reliant on Silicon Valley. Most of the early Chinese internet companies were founded by returnees who had sort of studied in the US or worked in the US and went back to China and kind of brought those seeds with them. But that era of kind of pure dependency gave way to sort of the golden age of copycat competition. So a lot of those early internet companies that had been founded by people who had returned from the US or been inspired by the US, they ended up going head to head with their US counterparts. So this is the era in which Google and Baidu are directly competing in Chinese markets. You have Alibaba competing with Amazon and eBay. And it's a period of time in which I think the going assumption certainly within the US, and I think maybe even within China or globally, you could say, is that these Chinese copycat companies, they don't really have anything to offer, and they are going to functionally be steamrolled by their American peers. But that period comes to an end in 2010. I mark at that year because that's the moment when Google finally gets blocked in China in January of 2010. And at that point in 2008, 2009, 2010, you'd seen in pretty quick succession, Facebook, then Twitter, and then Google all kicked out of the mainland Chinese market, blocked by the Great Firewall. And you kind of have this like temporary ceasefire, or like the dust kind of settles on the Chinese tech ecosystem. You have these nascent Chinese companies the sort of big American juggernauts had come in, had waged war, and kind of fought to a standstill before being kicked out by the government. And that gives way to what I think is maybe the most interesting period in US-China tech relations, and one that's going to set us up here, which is this period of free flows and firewalls. And so I won't explain all that here because we're going to dig into it. But again, it's this tension between deep and rich exchanges and flows back and forth of people, money, ideas, while at the same time the products and companies are blocked. And that sets up, I think, a fundamental tension that leads us right into the age of decoupling, which is, I think of it as kind of a way to try to resolve this tension between the two ecosystems. So we're going to look first at this sort of I date it roughly 2010 to 2018, when you've got free flows and firewalls. So first off, just looking at the flows themselves, I tend to break this down into 4 dimensions: people, investment, money, ideas, and supply chains. People, relatively self-explanatory in this case, and I think you could draw definitely a parallel to India and the US. You have lots of Chinese engineers coming to Silicon Valley, really powering a lot of its tech companies. You also have a certain number of those same engineers who have, cut their teeth in companies like Google and Facebook, going back to China to found a lot of important Chinese startups, especially in the AI space. You even start to have, say, Silicon Valley entrepreneurs setting up shop in China or taking the helm at Chinese companies. From there, the investment flows, I think, relatively self-explanatory. This 2010 to 2018, you see mounting flows of venture capital investment going in both directions. We're going to dive into that as we go. Ideas, I use ideas as kind of a catch-all phrase for both the more like formal research partnerships, as in, Google is setting up a research lab in Beijing, or Baidu is setting up its autonomous driving research lab in Mountain View. And also maybe the more informal exchange of ideas, the fact that, for a long time, Chinese companies definitely looked to Silicon Valley as inspiration, but especially beginning around 2014, 15, you finally have Silicon Valley companies or US tech companies looking to China for inspiration, trying to sort of crib features from WeChat, trying to imitate the same sort of cashless, cardless fintech ecosystem that took root in China. And supply chain is very self-explanatory, so I won't dig too much into that. So I guess maybe the point of emphasis here is that despite the fact that we think of the US and China as pretty far apart during this period of time, there's rich engagement at these are kind of the more grassroots level, or the somewhat informal levels at times. But of course, that makes a stark contrast to the way that products and the companies themselves go. So, the US companies, most of the leading ones at this point, are literally blocked in China. They simply cannot enter the market. Those that do enter, such as Uber or Airbnb, are functionally kind of beat out of that market, out-competed in that market. Chinese companies coming into the US, of course, they don't face, at least at this time, they did not face outright bans or blocks, but they were just never able to get traction in the US. And so I think of this as kind of the paradox or the tension of this period of time, 2010 to 2018, right before the age of decoupling. Very rich flows and rich integration at the grassroots level, but the products and companies are blocked. And that sets up a certain amount of tension. So just trying to put these in a very quick chart that we can kind of refer back to when we look at how decoupling has affected these pre-decoupling exchanges. Let's say I take this up to 2017, more or less. The people exchanges were extremely high. You had the flow of Chinese talent into and out of Silicon Valley was really at all-time highs. Investment also at all-time highs, but I'd say it was maybe slightly less impactful in each ecosystem. There's a lot of talk, a lot of hype about Chinese money in Silicon Valley because it was new, and likewise about US money in China. But I just rate that as kind of a medium level exchange. The ideas exchange, I'd say, was medium high and growing very quickly. And the supply chain, you'd call exchange or just integration, clearly very high, especially in hardware. But that all begins to change around 2018. And so first we're going to look at sort of why it changed, and then we're going to zoom in on the sort of the money, the investment dimension, and the people dimension. So why decoupling now, or why decoupling, say, starting in 2018? I think of there being kind of 2 main thrusts. And it's both in terms of how things are seen in DC. And maybe I'll just take this as a moment to emphasize, when we're talking about decoupling beginning in 2018, we're of course talking about US decoupling from China. China, through the Great Firewall, very much tried very early to decouple at the product level from the US far earlier. But why did things change in the US in 2018? Number one, you had DC, Washington, DC, the US government's pretty suddenly waking up to China's tech prowess, its capabilities, and also how deep this integration was with Silicon Valley. A few slides ago, when I was sort of showing those lines connecting China to the US tech ecosystem, I cut out the entire middle and east coast of the US, because those connections were very much a West Coast phenomenon, and they were not something that I would say the US government, Washington, D.C. was very aware of, very up to speed on. And I think part of the reason for that is they assumed that China would kind of never catch up, that China was so far behind. Maybe they're sending over some more investors, maybe there's more Chinese people showing up in Silicon Valley, or some Chinese going back to China. But this was not a major concern for the US government. And 2017-18, the Chinese tech ecosystem has sort of defied predictions that it's going to crumble under the weight of its own firewall. It's proven that it's actually very successful within its own firewall. And that gets Washington, D.C.'s attention. And when they kind of look around and look to Silicon Valley, they realize that this integration is deeper than they understood. And they get very sort of suspicious and anxious about all these different connections. That kind of leads us into number two. I think of decoupling as it's used in the US, at least, as very much an attempt by the US federal government to assert federal control, national control over what were previously, actions taken entirely by local actors, by, the US-China tech relationship from 2010 to 2018. If you want to say who were the most important people in it, it was Tim Cook, it was Mark Zuckerberg, it was Jack Ma, it was Robin Li at Baidu. These people were operating in many ways kind of without government oversight in both the good and the bad way. Without government oversight, in that they were free to pursue, sort of whatever they deemed to be the best opportunities, to pursue investment opportunities, to pursue research. But from the U.S. government standpoint, from a national security standpoint, from a national competitiveness standpoint, this was a kind of a rude awakening. And I see the last couple of years as really an attempt by DC to kind of get its hands back on the US tech ecosystem and ensuring that the way it relates to China is only as the US government wants it to or hopes it will. So zooming in quickly on investment and then on the people-to-people flows and going lessons from there. So the investment story is a pretty clear one of US government intervention and what that does. This is a quick chart of US VC flows into China, Chinese VC flows into the US. Pretty clear story. These are rising very quickly from 2013 to 2018 for about 5 years. I think the Chinese numbers there are likely underestimated to a certain extent. But you see the US flows going up very, very high. Chinese flows, basically, they're going up from around 100 million a year to over 4 billion by 2018. But then between 2018 and the present day, you have a steep fall. Worth noting, the numbers there for 2020 are only the first half of 2020, but even if you project them out, it still is a more than 50% fall from 2019 to 2020. So we've got this steep fall, and it pretty much all pivots around government action. So this is an area where the US government intervened very kind of forcefully and decisively, and it had a huge impact. 2018, there was a crackdown on Chinese VC investment. This is done through the US government's investment screening process, which is called CFIUS. We can go into that at a later point in time if people are interested. It was also the beginning of the US-China trade war, when the sentiment in and around Silicon Valley was really sort of forced to be brought in line with the US government across a bunch of dimensions. And so I think of VC investment, the sort of severing of these flows, as an example of where government intervention was very effective very quickly. And I guess I also see it as an area where there was a lot of kind of hand-wringing about this. What's the impact? Are we, Silicon Valley losing opportunities? Is it losing financing? Personally, I don't think this had a huge negative impact in Silicon Valley. If there's one thing that Silicon Valley does not need more of, it is money. They have plenty of money. And Chinese investment was, a boost in that direction. But I think Chinese money getting chased out of the ecosystem was not a death blow. Where there was some cost was in sort of exposure. The U.S. startups would sometimes use a Chinese investor as a way to gain insight or exposure in China, and that sort of fled very quickly. But that's sort of the investment story, the money story. I think the more interesting story is when we try to decouple people-to-people ties, or the flow of people back and forth. So here's a window into this. I'm going to use a project that I worked on the last year called the Global AI Talent Tracker. This is sort of an attempt to quantify the balance and flow of global AI talent over time, where my focus, of course, is on the US and China, but it brings in data from all countries. So the motivating question in building this project was, where do top AI researchers come from and where do they work today? And the way that we tried to pick that apart was to take a top AI research conference, in our case, NeurIPS, and we traced the careers of the researchers with papers at that conference. Where did they go to undergrad? Where did they go to grad school? Where do they work today? As a window into, how reliant is the U.S. ecosystem on Chinese talent? How reliant are European countries on talent from outside of Europe? And I'll sort of sum it up in two quick ways here and then bring it back to the decoupling point. This is our data on where the researchers who ended up at this top conference, so say researchers with a paper at the top conference, where did they go to undergrad? I think of this as the source countries for top AI talent. And here we see the US is a big source, Europe is a big source, but the number one source is actually China. China has almost 1/3 of the researchers at this conference did their undergrad in China. And you'll notice, of course, India shows up here at 8%. It would actually be the third leading country if you broke apart Europe. So pretty significant source country for that. But things look very, very different when you look at where do these researchers go to grad school and where do they work today. This is where the US really kind of gains its edge. It sucks up researchers from all over the globe and jumps from being just a 20% share to an over 50% share of this talent, essentially meaning, more than half of the researchers with papers at this conference currently work in the United States, whereas China's share shrinks. And India, unfortunately, goes from 8% to, when you look at where these researchers are today, it's, I believe there were, out of our sample of about 700 researchers, there were only about, it was either 2 or 3 who are currently in India. So it doesn't really register here. A lot to think about in that department. So this gives us kind of snapshots of where it goes, but I think to understand how this relates to US-China decoupling, and in a lot of ways what the US has to lose from this, it's worth kind of playing the visual out. So here, I hope this is relatively clear over the meeting. This is a Sankey chart, and these 3 diagrams essentially show the 3 columns. Oops. I showed to you before. So this is undergrad, graduate school, and where do they work today? And the cool thing here is you can click on any given node within this and see where all those researchers went. So if you click on the India undergrad node, see all the researchers who ended up at this conference and started in India. Where did they go after that? You see some going to Canada, Europe, Australia, but the largest chunk going to the US and staying in the US. Those from the middle to the right-hand side are where people go after graduating from their PhDs. So, the reason India, again, doesn't show up in the middle and the right-hand column is because pretty much all of the Indian researchers who ended up at this conference had either left India for grad school or left it for their current work. But let's take a look at the China piece, because that's sort of my wheelhouse more or less. So China is the biggest source country, but we see actually more Chinese researchers in this pool going to the US for grad school than staying in China afterwards. And maybe the most important thread here is actually this one from the middle to the right hand here. Shows the Chinese researchers who go to grad school in the US, what do they do after? You see a pretty small portion of them ending up back in China, some going to Europe, but the largest chunk there staying in the US, going to grad school, staying in the US long term. And this is kind of the chart that I use when I'm trying to communicate with US policymakers what the US has to lose if we execute a kind of across the board decoupling, including a kind of people-to-people decoupling, kicking out Chinese students or kicking out students from Muslim countries. And it's just a very clear depiction of how much the U.S. gains, that its standing here is almost entirely reliant on sort of imported international talent. And China is, at least in the realm of artificial intelligence, China is by far the biggest source country. So I think of this as both a picture of kind of what the U.S. gains, what it has to lose from a all-out decoupling with China, but it's also a picture of the way that these person-to-person ties are much harder to sever than, say, just the financial ties. With money, 2018, you institute a couple policies and immediately you see it shrink. On the talent front, it's much stickier. These are PhD students. They're in 7-year PhDs. There are a lot of people with green cards. There are a lot of people who have made their lives in the US. And despite we've seen something of a decrease in, say, Chinese students in the US, or decrease in the stay rates of Chinese researchers in the US, because they've frankly been in many ways driven out by the US government actions, these connections are, what gives me some hope is that they've proved to be stickier over time. So kind of just taking it back quickly to that decoupling by different dimensions chart. Again, the pre-decoupling exchanges, say, up to 2018, and the exchanges today up in 2020, end of 2020. So while the sort of people flows have decreased somewhat, and COVID is obviously a big wild card here, they still remain pretty high. You still have a ton of, well over 200,000, I think over 300,000 Chinese students studying in the US. And I don't think that's going to turn around in just the span of 1 year or 2 years due to government action. Contrast that with the investment flows, which have really fallen off a cliff. And here didn't have time to go into kind of the research or the supply chain part of it, but I think of those as much stickier and harder to decouple, and maybe more damaging to decouple areas. So kind of a takeaway from looking at the different dimensions of decoupling, I'd say, whether it's an app ban or a Chinese firewall, or in the US case, a block on investment, Chinese VC investment, that can lead to a very quick decoupling. And honestly, I think it's not the end of the world. It's something that has a lot of maybe negative effects one way or another, but it's, at least on the investment side, it's not quite as worrying to me. What would be more worrying would be if the ties between people, between ideas, and to a certain extent between supply chains were to come apart. But those have proved much stickier in the case of the US and China. It's been a crazy couple of years, and COVID is we have still yet to see all of the fallout from that. But at least in the, say, the last 4 years of the Trump administration, or 2.5, 3 years of concerted decoupling efforts by the US, these have been stickier. Last thing I'll just kind of conclude with is the question of whether there's lessons for India in any of this. And here I'm going to kind of throw out a hypothesis, an analogy that maybe it's more controversial, or it's more up for debate than anything I've put forward above that's in the US-China realm, but I think might be an interesting point for discussion going forward. So the analogy that I would put up for debate is that Indian technology's relationship, the Indian tech ecosystem's relationship to China in 2020 has a lot of similarities to the Chinese tech ecosystem's relationship to the US in 2010. Basically the analogy here is India is to China in 2020 as China was to the US in 2010. And maybe I'll just point out a couple of the kind of key points. So in both cases, you have an up and coming ecosystem that is in many ways integrating with, or is somewhat integrated with, an incumbent giant, but it's also competing with that incumbent giant. So, in China in 2009, 2010, this is Google and Baidu going head to head, Alibaba and Amazon and eBay going head to head. But you also have deep integration. You have a lot of investment flows. You have a lot of sort of people moving between the ecosystem. So you have simultaneously integrating and competing. And then you have kind of an exogenous shock to the system. You have some kind of geopolitical event leads to a ban on the incumbent giants' products. So in China in 2010, this was China blocking Google, Facebook, Twitter, and afterwards many more tech products. And in India in 2020, this is, of course, the series of app bans. Now, these came about for different reasons. In China, it was, once again, information control, a desire to, let the Chinese Communist Party continue to have its total monopoly on information and a direct conflict with Google over that. Whereas in 2020 India, the border conflict is different in nature, but maybe the way the governments interpret them have some similarities. So you've got up and coming ecosystem integrated with and competing with the incumbent giant. You have an exogenous shock that blocks all the products of the incumbent giant. But you have a kind of an open-ended question as to what happens next. In China, the products are blocked for a very long period of time, but the exchanges remain. And maybe just the last thing I'll throw out there before signing off or before passing the mic, I think China's recipe for innovation in the last 10 years has been kind of interesting. I break it down into 3 ingredients. You have a large semi-protected market, very large market that's big enough to attract players from all over the globe, but it's semi-protected. You wall it off to the point where your domestic companies are not going to be steamrolled by, say, the incumbent juggernauts. But the size of the market is enough to attract them. In China, at that point, you had sort of a critical mass of tangible resources being deployed. So this was many government sort of tech, entrepreneurship, startup campaigns in China. It was a huge flood of venture capital funding that happened around 2014, 15. But I think maybe the most relevant to what we're talking about here is the third ingredient was ties to the leading global ecosystem. Even as China blocked the leading platforms, it still maintained investment ties, it still maintained person-to-person ties, still maintained intellectual ties with Silicon Valley in a lot of ways. I think that's a key ingredient, and I think it's an interesting question for India going forward. What, if any, relationship do they want to have to the Chinese tech ecosystem or to the US tech ecosystem? I think that's the big difference here is when China was coming onto the scene, there was only one global incumbent juggernaut, that was the US. As Indian tech is coming onto the scene, there's 2 global juggernauts, and I think it makes the game almost more interesting. So looking forward to hearing what all of you have to say, but most of all, I want to hear what Sahil has to say after this. So I'm going to end my screen share here if I can. And there we go. I think I am off, and I will mute myself and hand over.
Hi, thanks, Matt. And sorry about that. I seem to have suffered one of India's classic problems, which is a power outage, which I don't know how much China suffers that anymore. But you know, we'll see. We'll tell the story. Thank you so much for that. And I have so much more to thank you for, not the least of which being the fact that, you know, I'm extensively using the framework that you put forward in our kind of prep call. Because so before I kind of get into this, let me introduce myself, and then I can justify why I so shamelessly stole Matt's framework for my analysis. So I'm no policy expert. I run a fintech company called Setu. We build banking infrastructure software. So basically, we build software that connects all kinds of applications to banks. The theory of change being that if the first wave of banking was that you have to physically go to bank branches and open your account and get access to your accounts that way, and that happened till say in the mid 2000s, and we call that say, banking and financial services 1.0. And then banking and financial services 2.0 was instead of having to physically go to a branch, you could digitally go to the app or the website of that particular financial institution to get those access to those same accounts. In around 2018, 2019, India had built up enough public digital infrastructure connecting identity, interoperable payment systems, and all of that to make the third wave possible, which is instead of having to physically go to the bank branch or digitally go to the bank's app, the bank or the financial services institution can embed itself into any third-party application. And you can essentially open a bank account or an FD or a loan or many other things from entirely third-party applications. And we at Setu started this company to build those bridges, and that's why we call it Setu, because Setu means bridge in Sanskrit. and make those kind of transactions possible. I had a brief role in playing in helping build that brief and very small role in helping build that public digital infrastructure that I spoke about. After my, one of my earliest jobs was at Aadhaar. I was part of the very early team at Aadhaar that I joined before the first Aadhaar number was rolled out, and I was there for about a year in its first year of operations. I witnessed how these systems are built, and then I was and still remain a core volunteer at the India Stack, which is a set of layers which includes what you know now as UPI, which is the interoperable mobile first payment system, eKYC, electronic signature, digital locker, GSTN, all of these pieces of public infrastructure, which I will reference towards the end of my presentation, played a small role in kind of designing these systems and evangelizing it within the ecosystem here. So that's my background. So my exposure to policy was limited to the extent of what it takes to build these digital platforms and evangelize them at scale. How can the government kind of play a role in promoting these platforms to drive transactions, etc. I've actually not studied India's relationship with China formally. So this is an amateur's take on what our relationship really is. And as you see on the screen, I've resorted to a very cheap pun, which is the story of a slogan, which basically still hangs quite heavy on Indo-China relations. And if you kind of, that's the truth. We've never really trusted them since 1962. And that's because, post 1947, let's say around 1950, India is the world's youngest and largest democracy. Mao's China is a struggling communist nation. We're both poor. We both were given very little shot by the Western observers at long-term survival. And I think Nehru at that point made a very genuine effort to extend a hand of friendship in making sure China got fair representation in the UN, maybe more than fair, some would say now. And even a couple of times refused to attend a couple of conferences because China wasn't going to be there. So was really making an effort to extend and show an effort. He visited Beijing in 1954, met Mao and the gang, so to speak, and really started popularizing this slogan called Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai, by our brothers, right? We are brothers. And there was a brief period between 1954 and 59, 1960, where ties were seen as rather warm. But then I think around 1959, 1960, the Dalai Lama fled to India. Tibet became a hot button issue. Bunch of stuff went awry, and then in 1962 we had a war, which on record I think is the first and only war that independent India has lost to this day, and that humiliation and that betrayal to a certain extent still hangs heavy over the relationship between our two countries. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that. And so I have taken on an adapted match framework and saying that, until even 2014, one could say until actually the 2000s, early 2000s, there was just not much. China's GDP per capita and our GDP per capita were around the same until 1990. We liberalized, and at that point, they also went through these kind of special industrial zone and special economic zone kind of liberalization in the 90s. We didn't really pay much attention to China until actually the early 2000s, where there was not much to separate us as far as we were kind of looking at them, or rather, no, we weren't really looking at them. And then in the lead up to the Olympics in China, etc., you saw China kind of really take off and start becoming known as the powerhouse of manufacturing. Cheap Chinese steel, cheap Chinese goods in general started coming to India. But broadly, other than anti-dumping and people getting freaked out about the price of steel and stuff like that, and some imitation goods, kind of the word Chinese mal became a very common used phrase where Chinese goods were genuinely seen as very low quality and not really seen as something to aspire to. There was practically, I mean, very little exchange of people. There was some investment perhaps, but very limited, I'd say, until 2014, from whatever I've read. The exchange of ideas was very limited. All our trade was essentially us buying 80% of trade between US and India and China was primarily us buying equipment on the cheap. And then, that kind of goes into the supply chain point. And from a digital attention span, actually, I should have populated that as not applicable, because really digital attention span wasn't even a thing back then. So that was kind of the first era of India's kind of relationship with China. You can say up till 2000, we didn't even really look at each other much. Between 2000 and 2014, there was this picture broadly. And then something changed. In 2014, both investments and the exchange of ideas started kind of taking off. I think, there are several sectors that we can talk about. We can talk about, real estate. We can talk about pharma. We can talk about all of these, but they're not my areas, and really, I'm not the expert on those areas at all. But what really kind of changed around 2014, from what I've read, is that the investment nature and the relationship nature changed from primarily state-led to increasingly market-led kind of investments and exchanges, so to speak. And this was the period, if you remember, there are two primary sectors that I'd like to kind of focus on in this particular discussion and kind of share with you. Where one was mobile phones. And pre-2014, Indian smartphones, people will remember Micromax, Carbon, and a few other, which were primarily Indian brands going and sourcing white label smartphones from China, branding it, and then launching it in India. And then in 2014, when the market grew large enough, I guess the Chinese just said, why are we doing this? Why don't we just go and sell our brands there as ourselves? And they've had one hell of a go of it. In the last 6 years, they've essentially dominated the market. They have 75% market share. 4 of the top 5 smartphone companies in India are Chinese. I think they, like 60,000 plus crores in sales, which is no joke. So this is one main area where we've seen them really make a splash, with Oppo and Vivo, funnily enough, being the sponsors for a time being. At least Oppo was recently displaced, but until then, its name was in the Indian cricket jersey, the most Indian thing of all things. And Vivo continues to be the title sponsor of the IPL. And they've spent a lot of money, a few hundred million each, I think 200 and 300 million each. And yes, the IPL sponsorship deal was more expensive than the Indian jersey sponsorship deal. I don't know what that says about us, but there you go. And then the other aspect, which really kind of went kind of nuts, is the investment in our startup ecosystem. And you've seen, there are a couple of venture firms, GGV, Morningside Ventures. I was still trying to ascertain whether SteadView Capital is Chinese or not, although my research indicates that it probably has some Chinese presence, but not that much. But those are still relatively smaller players compared to, if you see these 4 names, they're all strategics. Alibaba, Tencent, Xiaomi's sister concern called Shunwei Capital is one of the main investors in the ecosystem. And these people have picked up not small stakes. I mean, we're talking double-digit stakes, double-digit percentage stakes in 16 of 30 Indian unicorns. And it's all the big names that you can think of. Paytm obviously is an obvious name, where Alibaba has a fair amount of say. I wouldn't be wrong to say that. And everybody else from Big Basket to Byju's to Oyo to Swiggy to you name it, they all got Chinese money. And that was a great thing. I mean, from what I could tell, and my conversations with my peers in the ecosystem, they're fairly fuss-free investors. They haven't really tried to exert too much control in the more consumer apps. Although maybe something could be said for the relationship with someone like a Paytm, where the ties run deeper than just investment. I mean, they have a deal to exclusively use Ali Cloud for all their infra. There is, at least informal reports of significant technology transfers occurring between the two entities. But for the most part, it was a glut of capital, and it was great for most founders in the country. Especially in startups that had reached a certain scale. But I think if you look at it from the Chinese side, you see two specific phases of Chinese attempt of involvement in the Indian startup ecosystem, where, I think pre-2015, there was a lot of effort for WeChat, for example, tried to launch in India directly. A bunch of other applications also tried to build its own presence in India. Some succeeded, and we'll talk about that shortly. But for the most part, I think the larger Chinese strategic companies decided that they would rather have more of a string of pearls strategy. So if you look at Alibaba's investment portfolio, Tencent's investment portfolio, you will see investments in the largest e-commerce and digital payment startups in every country that surrounds China. So everything from the little bit in the Middle East, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Southeast Asia. So in all of these countries, any startup that has reached any kind of reasonable scale has a large Chinese strategic investor as a part of this. Excuse me for a second. Can you see my screen? Because yes, you can see my screen. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I just briefly lost power again, but I'm, learned my lesson the first time, and I'm on 3G, 4G. God bless Huawei, I guess. So if you actually, and this is where I give my deep thanks to Matt. This is straight lift from his wonderful analysis of US versus Chinese app market share in some emerging markets. The bluer you are, the more US companies, US made apps are in the top 10. The redder you are, the more Chinese made apps you have in the top 10. And if you see there in those 6 emerging markets, this was the second half of what happened between 2015 and 2020, which is that Chinese apps themselves also got really good at getting our attention. So this, 6 out of the top 10, it's kind of nuts when you really think about it. Everything from TikTok to all of these apps. UC browser was India's largest browser in the sense in terms of user base. It had embedded news and a bunch. I mean, news. Some of it was rather shady. ShareIt was India's largest peer-to-peer kind of sharing, data sharing kind of application in short range. Zender, which was another app that in the same category, was also from China. I suspect if you actually looked at the top 20 or top 30, that ratio would not change much. I would say that it would stay between 60 and 70% in the top 20 or top 30 apps as well. I know for a fact, for example, there was a company called NewsDog, which is a Chinese company, which was giving very tough competition to Daily Hunt, which is an Indian company, which also happens to have a Chinese investor called ByteDance in it, funnily enough. So there you go. I mean, either the largest company in a sector, largest tech company in a sector either had Chinese investment or had a large Chinese competitor, which was meaningfully giving them a run for their money, or both, as it matters. So they were coming at it from all sides, from capital and from the types of kind of applications that were coming into India. So, this was my kind of classification of what happened to that same map between 2014 and 2020. You saw more people coming in, at least in the sectors that I knew. These companies started establishing a more formal presence in India. There would be more Chinese executives coming here. Be aware that India's flow to China, I think, remained broadly unchanged. I don't think we went that much more to China at all. But there were definitely people from China coming here. Investment definitely went high. Between 2014 and 2020, there was close to $10 billion worth of investment in, I think, the startup ecosystem alone from Chinese companies. And ideas became definitely something that was interesting, right? I think the influence of the Chinese internet and the WeChat model and Alipay and Ant Financial success started really having like an influence on, and the fact that a lot of them had shares, had considerable positions in our largest companies, meant that there was an inevitable influx of the Chinese way of looking at the internet and building companies and having conglomerates instead of just a very super focused, the Silicon Valley approach of building a super focused kind of app, whereas China always had a slightly more diversified approach. Once you kind of build the user base, can you monetize it through many more channels, etc. We also, if you look at supply chains, I think there was definitely a deepening of supply chain relationships. All these mobile phone companies set up manufacturing plants in India and continue to build manufacturing plants. There were even a few auto companies that set up manufacturing plants in this country. Fosun, which is a strategic, which I mentioned in the previous page, basically ended up in buying out 74% of Glenend Pharma for like 1.3 billion or something like that. So they definitely started having more deeper ties in terms of manufacturing in India from these Chinese companies. And if you look at the digital attention span, that was something that, again, I think was dominant. It's something that is actually remarkable when you think about it, for the level of kind of influence that the Chinese had on the Indian tech ecosystem. If you really looked at the 400 million internet users in India, it would be safe to assume that at least 250 million of them had some version of a Chinese app, if not more, and spent considerable amount of time in them. So they were very good at it because the content was also localized to a certain extent. So it wasn't necessarily like we were, wired into Chinese propaganda, but we certainly were wired into Chinese apps, and that was something that I think was remarkable. And then, this happened, which, it happened. I'm no military expert. I have no expertise on on what happens on the border, but I sure know that history rhymes. So history rhymed, and the end of another verse came aside. We know that Doklam happened in the middle of this year, and then then came the ban. Now, what's funny here is that the ban is just one of many things that I think the Indian government started doing around this time. It continued to increase anti-dumping tariffs at this point. It also sent a directive to the RBI saying that anybody who has an NBFC license and has also taken Chinese money, please take a very close look. So the fintech ecosystem, which I belong to, certainly started asking questions as to what does this mean, particularly for regulated businesses, if you have any kind of Chinese money on the cap table. But as far as the ban goes, it was quite effective because all the top six apps that we mentioned are on that list, and they are no more in India. And all the apps that were, I think, any kind of scale in India were included in that list and were effectively banned. An interesting statistic that I picked up, though, is that, okay, this is still recent, right? It's like 5 months old, so hard to say what the long-term effects are going to be. But there was a glut of short video applications coming in to replace TikTok once it was kind of banned. And what the data that I saw recently said that less than 40% of the minutes watched has returned. Even if you total up all the other apps come together, the time spent on TikTok versus the time spent on all these other short video apps that have come, these TikTok clones together haven't even managed to hit half that scale. So it goes to show that interventions are good, but it takes time, I guess, for that to normalize to a certain extent, I guess. So this is my assessment of what happens post DOCLA. I think the flow of people, it wasn't the kind of flow of people that Matt so wonderfully illustrated in that wonderful analysis and that animation that he showed. It wasn't kind of research talent or academic talent, so to speak. It was commercial talent. So I think people who came in to establish businesses will stay to the extent, but I don't know if many more heavy new investments will happen in either direction, at least for the foreseeable future, until the situation changes or cools. Investments, I think, will continue to stay fairly high because India still remains a very attractive market for investors across the world. And few Chinese VCs that I have spoken to have been like, look, we're just waiting for things to cool off, and we'd like to continue. We had a longer term strategy. This wasn't a kind of quick hit and run. So, and the strategic stakes remain. So whatever investments that they've had will remain. The influx of ideas will also remain unchanged. I think ideas are very powerful things. You can't reverse ideas. Once they've kind of entered, then there's a natural curiosity that tends to drive it. Supply chains, funnily, I think haven't changed to that extent. Our balance of trade remains the same. We still remain heavily dependent on China for a lot of our imports. I don't necessarily see that, for all the talk that we've been having, over a longer period, perhaps it will change. But we simply don't have the infrastructure right now to make up for any major shortfall in that. The digital attention span, at least temporarily, has been reversed. But how long it will stay that way, and whether our Indian counterparts will, the Chinese apps Indian counterparts will build good enough products, and I hope they do. I'm quite confident that they will, to capture some of that attention span is something that remains to be seen. So the other thing to kind of note, I just saw this in the FT today, Matt and everyone else. This is was a great article on how much lending China was doing the last 10 years or so, and you see they were almost consistently beating the World Bank in pushing out the Belt and Road Initiative, which India, of course, didn't end up joining. But over the last 3 years, it's fallen off a cliff. COVID hasn't made things better for them. In fact, they're realizing that debt is a two-way relationship. You can kind of hook the country to a certain extent and get them to kind of work with you, but if things go badly for that country, then your outstanding loans don't really come back as soon. So they're working very very carefully on restructuring their loans. As far as I know, as far as I read in that article, they're still playing nice and agreeing to deferrals and some restructuring, etc. But if this situation continues and these economies that they've invested in continue to struggle, then it might not be such good news for Chinese state debt. And this is primarily, like you can see, China Development Bank and the Exim Bank of China. So what I read from that was that they seem to be focusing a lot more on domestic markets. And if you notice, the other major event that was tectonic really in the fintech world that happened was the cancellation of Ant Financial's IPO. I read an English translation of Jack Ma's speech that he had given at that event, and he technically didn't say anything false, but maybe just the way he said it probably rub these people the wrong way. And also, to a certain extent, there were capital adequacy norms that were being required of, and financial, which would have been met had they raised money from the IPO. So it's kind of funny. But you do see a certain inward focus from China on saying that, there's enough of this for now. Let's consolidate our, maybe they planned a big spurt, and then they see these changes in global trade and geopolitics in general. They seem to be picking fights with everybody and then withdrawing internally. That's my kind of amateur outsider's view of what China is up to. But the Belt and Road Initiative definitely gave us a sense of wanting to compete with China in some way or the other as a nation. And this is something that I can speak about, which is, the India stack, which we built as a digital infrastructure for ourselves, for this economy. We're really beginning to see that as our real export. So if China exports physical infrastructure with the Belt and Road Initiative, we really started looking at India stack as something that we can do, something that we can export, which is digital infrastructure. So our knowledge of this is essentially the stack as we know it today. The identity layer, which is Aadhaar, paperless layer, which has electronic KYC and electronic signature, a payments layer, which has UPI, a tax layer, which has an entirely digital tax platform for the whole country, and a consent layer with data management for the referred to as the NBFC account aggregator, which will help accessing data from various regulated entities much more interoperable and seamless. And these are all protocols that we've designed and deployed over the last decade since Aadhaar was born. And you're already beginning to see, at least in two major areas, in the identity layer and the payments layer, conversations around how can we help other developing nations build this similar infrastructure for their countries. In the identity piece, there is an open source version of the identity system that we built called MOSIP, which is the modular open source ID platform. And this is something that is currently housed in IIIT Bangalore, in the Indian Institute of Information Technology, Bangalore, and works with, on a pro bono basis, essentially helps other countries design and build their own digital ID platforms. And we have several countries like Morocco and a bunch of others in North Africa and in Southeast Asia in various stages of implementing this particular platform. And on UPI, which is this mobile first interoperable mobile payment system, we are already seeing conversations on how can we enable cross-border transactions both with the Middle East and with Singapore. The Monetary Authority of Singapore also showing a very keen interest on building something along similar lines, learning from the National Payments Corporation of India, NPCI, which runs UPI today. And I think that over the next 10 years or so, India's influence on what we refer to as public digital goods will definitely increase in stature as our own track record becomes more and more compelling. And we build out and use them at scale within our own markets. So this is, a kind of end note that I wanted to add, which doesn't necessarily have to do with China, and thank God for that. But yeah, so this was my kind of overview and analysis, and that's about it. That's what I had for this session.
Thanks. I don't know if we have Rudra or anyone's going to jump back in, but in the meantime, maybe I'd just say for anyone who has questions or thoughts, just contributing your own thoughts, feel free to drop that in the chat on the right-hand side there, and then we'll try to kind of incorporate those into discussion. I believe also one of the hosts of the meeting, who, not me or Sahil, if you have a question, you can raise your hand or say that you'd like to speak, and then they can give you the, what do you say? Open up the meeting so that you can chime in via video and then put in your own thoughts. I have some, in the meantime, while we're waiting for those questions, I have some questions for you, Sahil. I guess, I don't know, I had questions from every sort of segment of your presentation, but one that I'm most curious in right off the bat is, what do you think contributed to the success of Chinese apps from 2015 to 2019? Was it, just throwing out a couple of things that get suggested is, maybe there's some affinity. They're used to building at scale for developing country populations, et cetera, et cetera. So, essentially they have practice at this and they can easily deploy it over there. In other cases, maybe with TikTok, there is a sense that if they have a giant war chest from winning their own home market, they can pay a ton for advertising. And, that's a huge part of building a social network. I don't know, what do you attribute that kind of pretty remarkable success during that period of time to?
I'd actually agree with both of those, and I'd maybe elaborate a little bit on that. These apps, to get into the top 10 of any listing, you need very smart people to build this to a certain extent. And India's smartest have always had an aspirational bias for the West, and so there is, and I guess the same could have been said for China, right? And we were still very much in the copycat phase of our building. I think a lot of the apps that were built between 2015 and 2019 were heavily influenced by the SoCal paradigm, or the Silicon Valley paradigm of design and company building. And anybody who was anybody in the startup ecosystem was obsessed with Y Combinator and Steve Jobs, and how do you build, and reading Paul Graham essays, right, and talking about that kind of stuff. And that makes sense for a market like the US, where 70 to 80% of the demand is distributed fairly evenly across the top 10 urban population, urban agglomerated areas. Whereas in India, the market there for the Silicon Valley UX paradigm is 40 million people. Whereas if you looked at the Chinese apps, they had already been through 5 or 6 years of copycat, followed by another 5 or 6 years of really mass market adoption, digital adoption of those applications. So a lot of those principles of how do you do digital advertising, where do you promote your apps, what kind of content do the people want? So there is, the content that really took off on UC browser, on Hello, on most of those apps, on Share It, etc., was not exactly highbrow. In fact, it was almost pornographic. But it's what happens when you have an economy where the early adoption of the internet, even the mobile internet, was males aged 15 to 40, and they are obsessed with one thing, and then no surprise about that. And these Chinese apps, I believe, played very well into that instinct of the early adopters, of the mass adopters of the internet, mobile internet in India. And secondly, they were confident enough in this approach to actually put a lot of resources behind it. So they knew how to iterate quickly and had significant capital to deploy. Whereas, in India, you would have to spend a lot more time to even acquire those kind of resources, right, in the beginning, particularly in around 2015, 2016, the venture ecosystem wasn't. 2015 was when it began to kind of go crazy, but really it was still, the focus was food tech and a couple of other things back then. 2015 was a great food tech boom, as they now looking in retrospect. So both those, I think, played a significant role in kind of having that outcome.
And do you think, as you describe, okay, there's a Western aspirational Western bias in the types of apps that get built by people who are very plugged into that, but those don't necessarily resonate. Now, Chinese apps were hugely successful kind of in the wake of that, while maybe Indian apps were being built for the wrong audience within India. Do you think that kind of awareness has changed within the Indian entrepreneurial ecosystem, to say, okay, look, we're not California, we shouldn't build like California, let's take a different approach? Or do you think there's still that kind of a bias within the ecosystem?
No, I think in media kind of startups and news startups and things, media and content in general, I think there is an awareness of what kind of content tends to resonate better with Indian audiences. Plus, let's not forget, 2018 is when Geo really started having like a major presence, 2017, 2018. So there's been an even further proliferation of the digital audience in this country. Digital payments also really took off only in the last couple of years. So last 3-4 years. So we're really beginning to see those conditions rife for truly mass scale digital innovation, and it's beginning to happen. But for the kind of results to bear out, I think we'll have to see over the next 18 to 36 months what ends up actually happening.
That was kind of, and I'm still keeping an eye on the chat and whatnot for potential questions, but I'll keep going because I got a million questions for you in the meantime. So you said we'll have to see how it plays out in the 18 to 36 month range. What, if you had to make a prediction, say, okay, 6 of the top 10 apps were Chinese, those are now all gone. Who do you think those spots go to? And this is obviously not like you actually knowing the download numbers, but what portion do you think that gets filled by, home-built Indian apps? What portion gets filled by maybe more US apps or apps from elsewhere? Like, do you have a prediction as to who fills the void?
I would, and I'm putting myself out there, and I'm, I guess, an optimist by nature. I started a company, for Christ's sake. There's nothing more irrationally optimistic than doing that. But I would really kind of look at it as there's a good chance that 3 to 4 out of the top 10 over the next 18 to 36 months could be Indian apps, and we're already seeing some momentum in some of these young startups that are beginning to make a real dent in this. And I think the rest I don't know, but I think there's a good chance that 3 to 4 spots more than ever before will be occupied by domestic companies. I see a hand up.
Yeah, I think could one of our fellow hosts who knows what they're doing hand the mic over to Suman, I believe.
Yeah, hi. Good afternoon. Thank you for 2 very interesting presentations. It's really good to listen to both of you and, very different perspectives as well. My question is to do with the fact that the app ban that has come in India we need to look at the background in which it has been implemented, right? Like the border dispute with China, right? That has played a key role, right? And the reasons which are being provided by the ministry to put this ban in place was also to do with that, these apps engaged in activities which went against the sovereignty, defense, security of the country, and that's why these bans are being put in place. My question is, one, uh, how do we look at it from a regulatory point of view? Do we not need some standards? Because most of these apps are Chinese in nature, right? Like, so what about the other apps which may be engaging in similar activities? So how setting some standards for regulating these app bans and really ensuring that they are not discriminatory in nature. And second, I think it's I think you already asked that question. Once these apps have been banned, who takes that space in the market? Where do we go from here? Thank you.
Sure.
Matt, you want to give a perspective on how the Chinese thought about banning various characters? I'm sure what they said and why they did it were 2 very different things, and maybe then I can kind of share my view.
Sure. Yeah. So in China, they had a very they had an interesting route to like the way they justified bans. So for a very long time, foreign websites would be blocked by the Great Firewall. Originally, it was very sporadic. It started in the late 90s, very sporadic, kind of reacting to what's happening, but not really a holistic system. And by 2010, you could say there was a pretty solid system in place, but the Chinese government would functionally never own up to it. They would never admit to it. You'd have these kind of laughable moments at press conferences. I was a journalist over there, and where an American journalist would raise his hand and say, why is Facebook blocked in China? And the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson would say, I'm not really familiar with that. Facebook's blocked in China. I didn't know that. And it was this period of time when you could say that the Chinese government was still in many ways not comfortable with owning its own regulatory framework. There was still a sense of embarrassment, but that started changing around 2013, 14. So that's when Xi Jinping takes power. It's also they get a new internet czar, a guy named Lu Wei, who's now in prison for corruption, but who was kind of a very a lot of bravado in saying, no, like we are proud of the way that we govern the internet. We have a model, maybe even to export. They would call it cyber sovereignty or digital sovereignty. So the right of any country to govern its own sort of digital space. And so in China, they'll make sort of vague references to, any company is welcome as long as they comply with Chinese law. It's never clear what that would mean and what that would require. So in China, you've had this kind of the blocks are clearly, they are at the will of the government. They have been for a very long time. There's some attempt to formalize this in different ways, like, for example, things like data localization or the need to hand over to respond to government data requests in one way or another. That has started to be formalized in a series of Chinese laws, cybersecurity laws and whatnot that many in the US really don't like. But they were kind of unabashed about just saying, or about first instituting it and then figuring out how to justify it later. And I think that was very effective for what they were trying to do. In the US, we had kind of, we had a very funny situation the last year in that Donald Trump, maybe perhaps inspired by India, comes out with an executive order saying, banning TikTok, banning WeChat. And basically, both of those were either defeated in the courts or defeated in the American bureaucracy in one way or another. So these were, again, very similar to the Indian app ban in that they are alluding to concerns around data security and whatnot, but basically sort of just government bureaucrats acting at will or leaders acting at will. I think maybe like the interesting tension, and maybe this is something that could transition to your thoughts, Sahil, is on the one hand, you do see a need for a kind of a systematic, fair, non-discriminatory system for evaluating apps and data security globally. On the other hand, a big change that's happened in the US and that I think has, there's some thinking behind it, is to say, fundamentally, the relationship between the Chinese Communist Party and its companies is a different beast than the relationship between any other government and its companies. And they can make all kinds of assurances, they can do different kinds of data localization, but at the end of the day, we fundamentally do not trust this system to abide by the safeguards that they pledge to abide by. And I think this is one of the big kind of fault lines in global geopolitics these days, is how does a democracy or a rules-based society learn to interact with a government that's different, that's ruled by law instead of rule of law and whatnot. And so I think I'm maybe not as immediately concerned about, like, can we come up with a waterproof, airtight rubric that can be applied to all apps equally, whether they're Chinese or Indian or American. I think maybe there is something of a, hey, let's have a reset this period of time. It's messy. Maybe the block is for different reasons than what we say it is, but we're trying to reset the power dynamic, and then we'll go from there. Sorry, a bit of a long-winded way to get there at the end.
No, I think that context was very useful, Matt. And I think there's a little bit of both, right? One, which is, I really want to kind of double down on what you said, which is, the relationship between large Chinese companies and the Chinese state government is very different from any other company and its own government for the most part. Because from what I'm aware, and correct me if I'm wrong, that most of the large, popular, influential companies in China have actually a cell of the Communist Party in that organization, as a part of that organization. So Alibaba has a Communist Party cell in there, which aligns, quote unquote, the objectives of the government with the objectives of the district. So in any other jurisdiction, particularly fairly liberal jurisdiction, you will see that the goals of the company are to make profits for its shareholders and to grow, essentially. Whereas in China, there is a third stated, unstated, partially stated objective of also making the country kind of more explicitly successful. So, and if you looked at the ban framework. I think we need frameworks for lots of things, Suman. I think we definitely need frameworks, for example, for internet bans. We can't just go shut off internet in some part of our country just because we decided. And I think that's far more important than a framework for banning Chinese apps, because it's not like we've gone and banned Vietnamese apps or we've banned Japanese apps or we're willy-nilly banning apps from other countries. We had a military standoff and some very serious tension with a country that has historically betrayed us more than once. And so I don't think it's necessarily disproportionate. We did what we could while keeping our internet relatively free and open, which is we banned a bunch of Chinese apps that were really popular in the country. We do need a lot of frameworks in this country for a lot of things, like data protection being one of them, on civil internet bans and the freedom of access to the internet being another. But on this particular aspect, I'm inclined to agree with Matt and say, give them a free pass. Let them slap them on the back of the, a couple of times. It's okay.
I don't know if I gave out a free pass, but I have a certain level of empathy.
Half a free pass. We'll take it, whatever it is.
Sure. Suman, if you want to jump back in with your own thoughts, please just raise your hand again, and we can make sure to get you the mic, because want it to be a two-way conversation. I guess I had one follow-up there for Sahil on, you said we're not willy-nilly banning apps from other countries, and I guess my question is, what are the odds that you think something along those lines could happen? I think certainly in the United States in the last 4 years, we've had a government that it seems to respect a lot of American traditions less than we would hope. Maybe some people feel that there has been a certain amount of backsliding in different ways in India. And I wonder, what do you think are the odds, or would there be strong protections against similarly slapping bans on, say, pretend that Facebook doesn't abide by requests to remove certain types of content in the run-up to an election, and a party in power, whichever party is in power in India at the time, says, well, the only thing that we can do in this situation is ban Facebook for the time being, or ban WhatsApp. Do you think that there are safeguards in place? Is that an imaginable situation, or do you think that there's enough of a sort of that the Chinese situation is unique and that you had a literal armed confrontation, and that just kind of puts domestic politics aside and gives the government a free hand in a way it wouldn't otherwise?
I actually, frankly, this is the moment where I sit back and say, I don't know if there are enough safeguards or not. I mean, we won't know until someone takes it to court and the court passes a judgment. I'm no legal scholar on this particular aspect. I do know that it's not really been challenged in court. The Chinese ban, for example, at with any kind of meaningfulness. I do expect Facebook or some council associated with them to mount a vigorous challenge if the situation that you outlined were to transpire. I don't think it's an implausible situation. I think the scenario that you outlined is likely, possible, even. Possible, likely, even. But I honestly don't know what happens in that situation. I do know that our regulations as far as the internet in general and app bans and this kind of stuff is broadly the Wild West, in the sense that we don't really have even laws. I mean, the data protection law has not yet become an act, right? It is still being debated, etc. So that would be the first, I think, significant piece of legislation on digital and data since the IT Act of 2000. So my initial assumption would be, I don't think there is any legislation that covers this scenario right now, and it will probably will be left to the precedent of the courts.
So I think, if I'm seeing the clock right and doing the time zones right, I think we have just a couple of minutes left. Let's see. I think we got is that another hand up there? Yeah. That's Suman. Could we pass her the microphone again?
Oh,
however
the
that
team has
happens.
already given me access to the
Okay.
microphone. Thanks so much.
Good.
I actually agree with Sahil's point on the larger, legislative framework that we have right now. The data protection bill is yet to be passed. Right to privacy has been declared a fundamental right. Protection of personal data bill is yet to be passed, right? So the only option that the government right now has to deal with these kind of issues is the IT Act, and especially I think it's section 69A, if I am not wrong. And that, if you really look at that section, there have been several cases where that particular section has been challenged in the courts for most of the times for being arbitrary in nature, like not allowing the other party enough time to kind of respond. Now the thing is that once we have this new the data protection bill and the personal data protection bill in place, how does what would be the impact of these new legislation on this issue in particular? How and do you see it changing a lot, or so I'm not sure if I've made myself very clear, but with change in legislative framework, how do we see this space, and with special reference to fintech, because there's a lot of information which is personal information which gets collected in the name of providing better services. So how do we see that playing out?
That requires another 90-minute panel discussion, really. But if I were to quickly summarize, Suman, I think a large part of the personal data protection bill vests a significant amount of power into the data protection authority, and really says a large number of sections of that draft law says this part will be figured out or will be operationalized by the data protection authority. So a lot of the mechanics of how the law will be enforced per se is still not going to be clear even after we pass that law, until we institute that authority, until that authority has been staffed by bureaucrats, technocrats, whoever needs to staff it, and then they start carrying out certain actions to uphold that particular law. So I do know that I do have a sense that you've already seen the moves on data localization, which should have been, and compliance with that will be tracked more carefully, I assume. And when you're dealing with data, there's collection, storage, processing, sharing, and use. So I think there will be fairly detailed views, just like it was in the case of GDPR, on how each of those aspects of data must be handled. And I think it will be a matter of, we'll have to see what impact it will have on app bans per se. But on fintech, I do know that a lot of practices that are done today, which is kind of scraping data from SMS, etc., without even kind of explicit consent, will have to be either explicitly consented or won't be allowed unless you get it from the legitimate source, and so on and so forth. This is my guess as to how the change will kind of affect, but it's a very nuanced topic and requires a fair amount of time for us to kind of get into. So I'll just leave it at that, and we're probably out of time as well.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure hearing to both of you. Thank you.
Thanks, Suman.
Thank you.
Oh, you got one last question.
One more. The Biden. Yeah. I see. The question is kind of cut off there. Okay. As the Biden administration takes over from January next year, how will the trade war with China play out? Whether there's going to be intense containment or cooling the present tensions a bit, or simultaneously containing while engaging? Good question. So this is something I've been putting a lot of time into lately, into trying to figure out how we think the Biden administration stance is going to differ or not from the Trump administration. So big picture, I think the last one that you raised there, you say simultaneously containing while engaging. Big picture, I think that's the move. Probably you'd say outside of economic recovery, COVID recovery for the United States, the next biggest priority, the biggest kind of domestic and foreign policy priority for the Biden administration is going to be climate. And there's a lot of, kind of whenever we talk about our relationship with China, it's always, yes, we confront them on technology. Yes, we confront them on trade. But at the end of the day, we're the two biggest polluters and we need to be able to work with them on climate. I think it's a bit of an open debate how much, the Biden administration actually has to let the climate element define the U.S.-China relationship, or is it more the two countries will just kind of move in parallel? It doesn't much matter whether they coordinate on this front or not. But I think that that's going to be a very high priority, and it's going to prevent this from kind of devolving into the most, the kind of viciousness of the rivalry of the last few years. Maybe just kind of tying it on one last note back into what we've been talking about with India and its relationship to China and beyond. I think one of the biggest conversations in the U.S. technology policy, foreign policy plus technology policy world is, the U.S. kind of coordinating with allies to present a united front in combating Chinese technology practices, both capabilities at home and their influence and abroad. And I've had a lot of these conversations with people who are either, adjacent to the Biden administration or kind of in that world. And, they always end up saying, okay, we need to ally with all these other democracies, we need to ally with Europe. And then whenever they say, oh yeah, and India too, like India is the one representative that's not part of the high-income countries that always gets kind of brought into this conversation. EU, the European Union and the US, sort of natural allies in a lot of ways. Japan, South Korea, they have similarly tense, complicated relationships with China, and they're high-income countries with a lot of, with a lot of sort of source technology that we care about, semiconductors and stuff like that. But I think India is in a really interesting and unique position in terms of being the only other developing country, middle income country that has a strong domestic tech ecosystem, a large market, and frankly, that can just interface with the US and the EU more easily than a lot of other countries because of the shared language of English. And so I think it's a real opportunity for the Indian tech ecosystem and maybe the Indian government or leadership in different ways to say, hey, yeah, we want to have our voice heard in this. It's don't forget about all the non-high income countries when you're having these kind of contained China alliances and whatnot. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of interest from people in Washington, D.C. about how to better partner with Indian technology companies and the government. This was one of the top recommendations of what's called the National Security Commission on AI in the US, kind of the body designed to advise the US government on how to work on AI issues. Partnering with India was one of the top priorities there. And it's something that I think a lot of people who are going to go into the Biden administration put a pretty high value on. So opportunity for a lot of people, on this call or in this community to try to reach out and push things in a direction that's positive for India. Okay, excellent. I think we got it. I don't know if anyone's supposed to sign on here to say goodbye. Do you have any closing thoughts you want to put in?
No, I think I really enjoyed this discussion, Matt, and I want to take this opportunity again to say thank you for shepherding me through this, and thank you to everyone for joining in on the discussion. We hope you got something out of it. We hope you learned something from it. We're both. I mean, I'm on Twitter at Sahil Kini. You're welcome to reach out to me there. Thank you again for spending some time with us this afternoon or this middle of the night for Matt.
Yeah, I'm putting my Twitter and my email into the chat there. I love talking with different people about this stuff, so feel free to reach out if you're interested. And otherwise, have a good day.
Hi, Matt, Sahil. Thank you so much for doing this. Thank you to everyone who's attended. And yeah, I think that was great. I popped in and out of the session. It sounded very interesting.